What's up, everybody? It's FYGP, and today I want to talk about an interview with Richard Spence, a history professor at the University of Idaho, talking about Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. Let's take a listen to this.
Relationship between Wall Street and Russia. It's not a haze that ends, but really mutates into another relationship.
Yes, and there are phases to this, and you go back, you address some of the events in the 19th century. One of those Jewish emancipation, of course, was a big thing in Russia because Russia had absorbed a huge Jewish population when it partitioned Poland along with Prussia, and so this has a significant impact on Russia. And you also have the reforms. Then you have the 1880s, 1890s, the Jewish migration to the United States, which is an important factor here because there were many wealthy financiers in the United States, which played an active role in the revolution. Revolutions are attempted, the border revolutions. And you talk about the 1905 revolution, and one character, Jacob Schiff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, first, let me. Okay. We're jumping the gun. I'm sorry. I wanted to first address why was Russia targeted? And you addressed that in the early part of the book about what Russia was so unique, or why it was considered perhaps a potential threat. It had so much latent ability or latent potential to be a real economic powerhouse.
Well, I guess another way to put that is why have attracted the interests of American capitalists. Mm-hmm. And by the way, British capitalists, but we're looking at American capitalists. Mm-hmm. They see each other, and didn't American capitalists have enough to rob and pillage in their own countries, going elsewhere? The simple answer to the latter part is no. There's never enough to rob and pillage. But Russia is, you have to put things in perspective. The United States, late 19th century, today is a very large country. Large geographically, large in terms of its population, even larger in terms of its economic imprint in the world. And that was the same situation if one goes back to, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century. But Russia, then and now, is larger. I mean, it basically embraces about 1/6 of the world's land area. And while much of that land area may consist of tundra and subarctic forests and steppes, nevertheless, in the sheer immensity of that territory is just about every form of mineral wealth known to man. And that includes oil, diamonds, gold, silver, platinum, immense forests, land with huge agricultural potential. Its sheer size of real estate is one of the things that makes it attractive. The other thing about that, along with this kind of huge reservoir of riches, was that in the early 20th century, that reservoir of riches was almost entirely unexploited. So one of the things that Russia had was a great deal of territory. One of the things it didn't have, to sort of, again, make things fairly simple, is much internal capital or much means to generate it. So one of the things that Russia was trying to do at the end of the 19th century, beginning in the 1890s, was to industrialize. And industrializing meant a transport system and building railways so you could reach the resources, and then building factories to exploit them. All of that took a great deal of money, much of which Russia could not produce on its own, and therefore it courted foreign investment and foreign loans. So it's a huge field for potential investment. That's what attracted American capitalists along with any other self-respecting capitalists around the world. There was no other real estate interest that you could invest in with much greater potential for success. There was so much there, and there was so much of it that was untapped. And Russia was actively seeking the funds from abroad to do that. So in the early phase of this, America is not a big investor in Russia before 1917. There are some of them. Singer Sewing Machine, for instance, one of its biggest they sold lots of sewing machines in Russia, and things like American Harvester and manufacturers of American equipment did great business there as well. But pretty much prior to the First World War, the U.S. had been marginalized by the big investors, which were above all the Germans, and then the French and the British, even the Belgians and the Dutch got into this. So it's one of the things that Americans, when 1917 rolls around, that was one of the places where they really felt that they could take advantage of a situation that hadn't been open to them before. Especially if you're at war with Germany, and Russia is at war with Germany. Well, if the Germans, which were Russia's biggest trading partner, are going to be cut out of the picture, then who's going to take up the slack? But then there's the other thing that you mentioned. There's Russia with its vast potential for investment and potential profit. But there's also the question of what would happen in the long run if Russia was to develop its potential. And especially to develop its potential, if all of Russia's industrial potential was tapped, if its resources were brought online, that would really make it a force to be reckoned with. It's even one of those things that could make it a force beyond the control of any other states. So there's another issue here. Russia has great potential. It has a potential for investment, but it also has a potential that if it was fully developed or even significantly developed, it would become a dangerous rival. And therefore, there was an idea to both exploit those riches, but also, even better if you could, in a way that would neutralize a potential threat to your interests in the future, further on.
Interesting. Yeah. And so first of all, you have Russia as sort of like the mother of all emerging markets. You could
yeah, there you go.
Yeah, the mother of all, as the term that we came later off in the 20th century. Emerging markets, a lot of growth potential. But then now that's this latent or this potential to be a great power would make a lot of people in the West anxious or concerned because, especially considering the ambitions of the Anglo. I guess at this point, maybe the Anglo-American Empire, and the geostrategic or geopolitical ambitions, or at least objectives of the British Empire, which was to dominate the planet, which it was pretty much doing at the time. But almost,
they were pretty good at that.
Yeah, and using their American cousins, right, in the process of doing this. But how does this factor into something like we've heard a lot about the Mackinder Doctrine, the sea power versus the land power. Russia would be the ultimate independent land power if it was able to coalesce its resources, develop infrastructure in these things. It would sort of undermine that geostrategic point of view, right?
Well, it would give them control of what Mackinder called the heartland, which is one of those ideas that own better than it actually is. And I'm not sure that controlling Tibet and Xinjiang and Mongolia is necessarily all that it's cracked up to be, but it gives it this kind of huge pivotal position. The other thing about the Russian Empire is that it stretched from Europe, it stretched from at least the borders of the Atlantic, it reaches the Arctic Ocean, it reaches the Mediterranean, all the way to the Pacific, and that's something that really only the British at that, and what really started the British Empire, was always to prevent money.
We're back. Okay, sorry. So, Russia,
big subject. Okay. So, where we were talking about this kind of three-way relationship between the British Empire, the emerging American Empire, we're talking about the early 20th century, and then, of course, the Russian Empire. And the Russian Empire, as we were just noting, was a vast realm for investment and potential profit, in which the British, by the early 20th century, were already heavily invested. I think the British are maybe number 2 in foreign investment, especially heavily invested in Russian mines. That's one of the things that so the Lena Gold Fields and mines in the Ural and elsewhere, those were huge companies like Russo-Asiatic Consolidated Mining Corporation were basically British controlled. And so from the British standpoint, one of the things that they would have wanted to do was to keep the Americans out, which they did pretty successfully up until the First World War. The other thing, which was, let's say, arguably part of the British imperial agenda, was the British British were heavily invested in the United States. So there was a huge amount of British money there as well. And one of the things that money and the economic influence was used to do, besides make more money, was to try to bring American emerging imperial interests into sync with those of Britain. So remember, the goal of the British Empire, sensible goal for an empire, was to do everything you could in order to prevent a powerful rival from emerging, any empire that would be potentially larger than yours. So Russia had that potential, but that potential was still pretty far in the future. The United States was already showing that potential. Germany was also, rather for the British, dangerously showing that potential. So one of the things that you have is there are these connections between British and American capital. And so one of the ways in which you would keep American geopolitical interests in sync with Britain, that is, by in sync I mean either complementary or at least not directly competitive, was through the financial interests. And so if you were to look in the United States, if you were to look on Wall Street in 1900 or any time briefly before or after that, the 500-pound gorilla was J.P. Morgan and Company. That was the single biggest investment bank in the country. And of course, its tentacles then reached out into petroleum and into steel in particular, and into shipping and insurance. And one of the things that's important about Morgan is that Morgan Sr. and Jr. were staunchly Anglophile. There was a very close relationship between the Morgan financial interests and British financial interests. And that meant that one of the things that they sought to do was to not compete with each other. It's one of those things that's often considered to be the lifeblood of capitalism is competition. But one also has to remember is that the one thing that really any good capitalist hates more than anything else is competition. And the reason for that is that competition costs you money. To compete, you have to compromise, you have to cut your prices. And so the natural tendency is always towards a kind of cartel. So maybe one of the ways you could think of it is that what the British desired with the emerging American empire was it was somewhat too big to engulf, maybe too powerful to turn into a potential enemy, but it was something which could be brought into a kind of cartel relationship. And if you want to, you could even extend that on and argue that is the basis of what we call today the special relationship between the United States.
So a lot of interesting stuff in this interview. I will leave the link in the description for you all to watch it. And it really explains why you have this kind of war against Russia going on, and this has been going on for many hundreds of years, because Russia, as explained by the professor right here, Richard Spence, had huge potential to be one of the biggest rivals. Obviously, at the beginning of the 20th century, they were one of the biggest rivals of the British Empire. So that is why they, in many ways, always sought to defeat Russia and always were engaged in wars against Russia. And just the mere fact that they have all of these natural resources makes them a superpower. And, going back further in time, after the fall of the Soviet Union, for example, you didn't see a lot of propaganda against Russia in the West at all, because Russia was weak. Take a look at how the GDP of Russia dropped, for example, during the 90s when Boris Yeltsin was in power. So, yeah, this is what has happened. And this policy, in many ways, is still continued further in the 20th century. It hasn't really changed very much, except that, you had the whole... they're still trying to contain Russia and contain Russia's development with sanctions and with all kinds of other stuff. The policies of containing one of the biggest land powers, if not the biggest land power on Earth, have not changed at all. You know, when it goes back really to the Crimean War is where it goes back, because that is when the whole thing started. That is when Britain, France, and Sardinia and Turkey declared war on Russia, the Ottoman Empire, I should say.